scene of a violent crime. Police searching for clues that might identify the killer. I'm Jerry Orbach, and this is The Hunt, where we look at the history of criminal detection and how it has evolved in search of the criminal. Tonight, two techniques that have been around for a century and are still evolving: fingerprinting and ballistics. Anyone who watches courtroom dramas knows that one item can often seal the case: the revelation that the defendant left something behind at the crime scene, a clean set of prints. DNA evidence and other new technologies get most of the publicity, but fingerprints and ballistics still nail most of the bad guys. Here in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, a horrific crime took place which was to rock the very foundations of forensic science. On the afternoon of December 23, 1989, an intruder interrupted the Christmas preparations of the Harris family. Before leaving, he set the house on fire to destroy the evidence of his crime.
My sister and her family were all hog-tied, wired. Each of them had had a pillowcase over their head. Doe and Tony each had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber rifle modified as a pistol, marked 3 times. Shelby was discovered in the master bedroom, apparently as a result of sexual assaults during the course of that evening before. She had been shot 3 times in the head as well. Whoever set the fires were obviously wishing that the house would burn to the ground and all the evidence would have been destroyed.
But the evidence was not destroyed. The bullets that killed the Harris family matched the retrieved gun of the prime suspect, who was killed in a shootout with police. He was 31-year-old Michael King. His mother was also arrested in connection with the murder, but the only evidence that conclusively linked her to the Harris house was a fingerprint, which a detective said he had found on a gas can at the scene of the crime.
This is the gas can that was in the living room of the Harris residence the day I arrived. This is also the gas can I examined that same day, and also the same gas can that I lifted the fingerprints from.
Mrs. King, anything to say at all?
Do you have anything to say?
Yeah. But it's not playable. You want to hear
Okay,
it?
let's move back. What is it, Mrs. King?
It's called truth. And it's called justice.
Was it not done,
And it's
Mrs.
called the American way.
2 bedrocks of forensic science had helped to solve the Harris murders. Fingerprints had proven Shirley King's guilt, or so it seemed. And ballistics had proven her son's guilt as well. Tonight, we examine the history of ballistics and fingerprint evidence in the 20th century and explore the evolution of these important but not always perfect techniques of crime solving. It was in the late 1800s, in the remote Argentinian town of Necochea, that the forensic science of fingerprinting was first used to solve a criminal case. Eduardo Alvarez was the detective assigned to the investigation, and his report tells the story.
July the 12th, 1892. The crime took place in the house of the Caraballo family. The victims were found with their throats slashed. The mother, Francisca Rojas, accused her neighbor, Ramon Velasquez, of slaying the children and trying to do the same to her.
The local police used extreme methods of interrogation, and when Velázquez would not confess, he was forced to spend 2 nights with the corpses of the 2 children. Still, he protested his innocence. News of the murder reached Buenos Aires. The province's chief of police was outraged by the treatment of the suspect. He ordered Álvarez to look into new methods of criminal identification being used by an enlightened civil servant, Juan Vucetich. Vucetich had developed ideas by European scientists about fingerprint patterns. No 2 prints were the same, and they did not change throughout life.
Tienen el nombre de una persona. La combinación de esos dibujos.
The identity of a person is the combination of these patterns. What we call the arch, the whirl, the outward loop. Behind the fingerprinting, the identity appears, and it's my job to interpret that.
Mi función específica es devolver.
Vucetich gave a letter to each of the 4 basic fingerprint patterns: arches, inward loops, outward loops, and whorls. The letter was used to denote the pattern on the thumbs and the number for the fingers. The prints of each hand could be written as 1 letter and 4 numbers. In this way, one set of prints could be compared to another on file. In 1892, for the first time, fingerprints could be categorized so they could easily be compared in criminal cases. Armed with Vucetich's system, Álvarez traveled across the country to the house of Francisco Rojas. There, to his surprise, on a doorframe, although faded with time, was a bloody thumbprint. Álvarez preserved the evidence. Both Francisco Rojas and her neighbor Velázquez were fingerprinted. The print on the doorframe matched Francisco Rojas's right thumb. The proof was supported by her subsequent confession. And the prints that condemned her to indefinite imprisonment are preserved for posterity. What began with the Rojas print led to all Argentinians being fingerprinted 3 times in their lives. And in less than a decade, fingerprinting had spread around the world in the fight against crime.
The scientific crime-busting laboratory where sleuthing is done by ultra-modern technology. This is the G-Man science which has helped in the conviction of more than 11,000 federal offenders during the last 3
years. In 1930, Goddard's breakthrough led to the first crime lab in America established in Chicago.
There it is. Under the magnifying glass it matches. That man's record will be sent to the local police.
The FBI followed suit in 1932. It seemed ballistics and fingerprint evidence could not lie. And during the years between World War I and World War II, they revolutionized crime protection. It wasn't until 1943 that the first serious questions were raised about the reliability of fingerprinting, and it was in the unlikeliest of places. Nassau, the Bahamas, a distant outpost of the British Empire, 190 miles off the coast of Miami. The new governor was Britain's abdicated king, the Duke of Windsor. The Windsors led an exclusive clique, which included many rich tax exiles. Among them was the Duke's close friend, millionaire Sir Harry Oakes, whose gold mining fortune left him one of the richest men in the world at that time. On the morning of July 8, 1943, news reached Government House that Sir Harry Oakes had been brutally murdered. That morning, the Duke made an unusual decision. Instead of summoning help from Britain, he called Miami. 2 American detectives who acted as his bodyguards there were flown over to the Bahamas immediately. On arrival, they were taken directly to the crime scene by a young Bahamian policeman, Conrad Knowles.
How cruel can one be to have murdered a person, either outside or in bed, And if he was still alive, and brought him there, and then light the mattress afire.
Sir Harry had been beaten over the head with a sharp instrument, and it appeared his body had been set on fire while he was still alive.
The two detectives, after looking around the scene, immediately start to do some work. They were looking around, obviously looking for fingerprints.
One of the American detectives, Captain James Barker, claimed a breakthrough. He said he was able to take a clear fingerprint from a dressing screen.
The method that Barker used was lifting, which is developing the print with powder. Barker used a black powder, which can be dusted onto a surface. That develops all of the prints that are on the surface. Now, to lift the print then, Barker used a white rubber backing that had an adhesive surface to it. So, for example, if we take this backing and apply it to this surface, then the adhesive on this piece of rubber is going to lift all of the powder, and the fingerprint itself, in fact, from the surface. Now we peel this off, and now the print has been transferred from the glass to this piece of rubber.
The print that Barker produced matched that of Count Freddie de Marigny, who had recently married Sir Harry's 19-year-old daughter, Nancy. Barker chose the day of her father's funeral to break the news.
And the manner in which they arrived at the house and came pounding up the stairs and into my mother's bedroom. They thought they'd got their man and they were going to put him in the prison, and that was that.
Convinced of his innocence and denied her inheritance until the age of 30, Nancy Oakes spent her own savings on forensic experts for the case.
Nancy Oakes de Marigny, 19-year-old daughter of the victim, loyal wife of the accused.
She stood up to her mother, who couldn't believe that it wasn't true, that Freddie had not murdered Harry Oakes, and she stood up to the world in a way, because everybody was willing to accept him as the murderer.
The trial of de Marigny began in November 1943. De Marigny was at an obvious disadvantage. The fact that his fingerprint had been found by Barker at the scene of the crime seemed to incriminate him completely, until questions were raised about the validity of the print. De Marigny's fingerprint had been lifted from the crime scene.
The correct procedure in that case would have been for Barker to have left the print in situ on the screen and produced it in court there for everyone to see, or photograph the print in place so that it could be shown that the mark did exist on the screen. By lifting the mark, he destroyed that evidence, and therefore the court had to rely on his word alone as to the source of the fingerprint.
Well, when Barker first gave his evidence, he was very sure of himself and very cocky. And he, as the cross-examination came through, he got less and less pleased with himself. And in fact, he became extremely upset. And the judge became extremely cross.
So by your process of lifting this print on the rubber matting, you deliberately destroyed the best evidence, which was the print itself.
The manner of the lifting does destroy it, yes.
It occurs to me that I may well admit this print into evidence and let the jury decide whether it's legitimate and what weight to give it. If they have any reason to doubt its genuineness, they can discard the print, and for that matter, the testimony of this witness altogether.
When examined closely, a background did appear through the photograph of the print, but it did not look like the background from the screen.
On the print that was presented in court, you could see some dots very plainly in the background, both underlying the print and to the side of the print, which were totally inconsistent with the area from which Barker claimed to have lifted that print.
Well, I rather rather suppose they came off a glass, a drinking glass. Because I remember there was a set of sort of lemonade glasses and jug at the house of my father, with the beach house. Sort of a cheap glass, you know, that you have for children, for lemonade or something. I think he had a glass of water when he was in the house, when he was being interviewed.
The case rested on a fingerprint, and whether the jury would accept its source solely on the word of a police officer.
The sensational 22-day trial ends as Judge Daly receives the verdict of the jury, acquitting Count Alfred E. Marini of murder. Not guilty was their decision, but they voted unanimously for the Count's immediate deportation. De Marini leaves the courthouse a free man, though authorities may send him to his native island of Mauritius. There is still an unsolved mystery. Who killed Sir Harry Oakes?
Reasonable doubt had been raised as to the source of the fingerprint in the case. No one was ever convicted for the murder of Sir Harry Oakes. Fingerprint evidence was not foolproof, but it was still one of the best ways to catch a criminal, as a landmark case in the English town of Blackburn was about to demonstrate. The rape and murder of a sick child in the late 1940s triggered the biggest fingerprint investigation in British history. On May 15, 1948, at 12:30 a.m., a 3-year-old girl was abducted from the children's ward at the Queen's Park Hospital in Blackburn. Within 2 hours, the police were called.
We got into the van. We weren't told at that time where we were going, and the next thing we recognised were the gates of Queen's Park Hospital. I remember I was with a colleague of mine, and he and I walked down the field. We found the body of a child just beyond the children's ward. We knew, obviously, she was dead from the position she was in. It was only as we walked away that I personally experienced a feeling of horror. And it's the only way I can express it. It was unthinkable that something could be done to a child like that.
The chief constable in Blackburn called Scotland Yard for assistance in the early hours of the morning. Detective John Capstick of Scotland Yard was sent to Blackburn. His only clues were some footprints and a set of fingerprints left on a Winchester bottle, which appeared to have been moved from a trolley before the child was taken from the ward.
At the time, it was a mystery how the Winchester bottle had come from the trolley, and there could only be one real explanation, and that was that the intruder had taken it down the ward before he selected his victim as a weapon. If he was confronted with any of the staff in the hospital, I suppose the Winchester bottle acted as a weapon.
When the fingerprinting of all the hospital staff failed to turn up a match to the print, police took the prints of every patient or relative who had visited the hospital during the last 2 years. Still, there was no match. Capstick came up with a radical solution for his men.
So it was decided that they'd take the fingerprints of the entire town. But it was an impossibility.
But Capstick thought otherwise. Using the electoral rolls, police went door to door, house by house, street by street, taking the prints of every man in Blackburn over the age of 16 who was not bedridden. All the prints were taken on a voluntary basis.
We had no objections. Somewhere along the line, I suppose, we wished they would. If somebody had something to hide, they would be the person that would be making the objection.
No matter how hard the police tried, they still could not find the killer. Capstick's investigation seemed to be getting nowhere.
They were losing a little bit of heart because they're getting no near, and the inquiry was winding down considerably. There were only about 4 men still doing the fingerprinting.
Then one of the remaining officers had a thought. Local servicemen posted outside the city at the time of the murder might not show up on the electoral rolls. However, rationing was still enforced in post-war Britain, so they should still show up on the ration book lists.
Only amounted to a few hundred at the end. There were just a few hundred who were sweeping up, if you will. And it was among that 200 to 300 that Griffiths was found.
Peter Griffiths, a 22-year-old former soldier who worked locally, was fingerprinted. The result was a perfect match to the one on the Winchester bottle. There were 16 points of comparison. The match was beyond dispute. He was arrested and confessed to the murder. On November 19, 1948, Peter Griffiths was hung for the rape and murder of the 3-year-old child. As promised, all the fingerprints taken in the case were publicly destroyed or returned. The perpetrator had been caught, and no one's civil rights had been violated in the process. The remarkable identification of Peter Griffiths re-established the public's faith in fingerprints and in the integrity of the police. In the 1980s, after decades of success in catching criminals, the reliability of fingerprint evidence would face its biggest challenge. On August 30th, 1988, a man walked to the front door of Lawrence Meeker in Enfield, New York. He asked the 81-year-old man for a glass of water. Mr. Meeker was later found savagely beaten on the floor of his kitchen. New York State Trooper David Harding went to investigate. A known petty criminal, Mark Prentice, was arrested after being named by 2 other suspects. Officer David Harding claimed to have found Prentice's fingerprints in 2 places, on Meeker's sink and on some Budweiser bottles found in the shed adjacent to Meeker's house.
I knew I was not in the man's house. I was not on his premises. There was no reason or no way they could have found my fingerprint in that man's residence, anywhere.
Prentice was charged with the assault and was tried in a Tompkins County court. Harding's fingerprint evidence proved to be the showpiece of the trial.
This is a chart that depicts a photo enlargement of the latent print in question that I lifted from the sink on this side being the right-hand side facing, is a enlargement of a known fingerprint of the defendant in the case, Mark Prentice.
I knew what he was saying. It wasn't true. And when he held up he had to go through the point system of the fingerprints, so many identifiable points on the card. And when it got to the point where he said, yes, these are 12 comparison points on this fingerprint, and he said, yes, these are the defendants, and yes, I did lift these off the kitchen sink in the victim's house. And you can see the jurors looking at me like, you worthless, you know? And it was hard to deal with. I kept asking the judge if I could sit in the other room because I couldn't tolerate the lies. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't deal with it.
Harding's evidence was crucial in the conviction of Prentice. While Prentice was sentenced to 15 to 25 years in prison, Harding went on to bigger cases. December 23, 1989, an intruder entered the Harris family home in Dryden, New York. He murdered all 4 family members and set their house ablaze in a horrific quadruple homicide. David Harding acted as liaison with the late Mrs. Harris's brother.
David was a very affable, very friendly, open individual. He demonstrated to me certainly friendship, very, very sincere, very, very affected by what he saw. I don't think that there was anyone who entered that house, that entered and saw that crime scene, who wasn't really affected by it. And David was a very professional individual. Obviously, he had a very bright career up until this point, certainly, and an awful lot of experience. He spent all of Christmas Eve in Shelby's bedroom. He was going through her high school notes, all of her textbooks, all the little notes between girlfriends that he might find in the closet, looking for some clue, some kind of track that might lead to a solution to the case.
After an undercover operation by Harding police identified two suspects, Michael King and his mother Shirley King, their house was raided and Michael King was killed in a shootout. Shirley King was arrested and found in possession of the Harris family's credit cards. But when she was brought to trial, only one piece of evidence linked her to the murders.
This is the gas can that was in the living room of the Harris residence the day I arrived. This is also the gas can I examined that same day, and also the same gas can that I lifted the fingerprints from.
How do you know it's the same can?
Harding's print was enough. King got 15 to 30 years in prison for burglary and arson, and Harding became a police hero. He went for a job interview at the CIA, where he was subjected to a polygraph test. During the course of 2 days of interviews, some unexpected revelations emerged. The tape was played to Special Prosecutor Nelson Roth, who began to investigate further.
The CIA wanted to know if there was anything in Harding's background that reflected his unfitness for service as an employee of the CIA. And inquiries were made about any prior crimes that Harding may have committed. And I think it was his response to those questions and the reaction on the polygraph itself that indicated that Harding was lying, and that's what started the inquiry about criminal conduct. The crime, as it turned out, that Harding had made the reference to in the interview with the CIA was an assault on a gentleman by the name of Mr. Meeker, who lived in Enfield, New York. David Harding testified under oath in a criminal prosecution in Tompkins County that the fingerprint that he found on the kitchen sink matched Mark Prentice's known inked impressions. In fact, the print that was used in the case came from a Labatt's beer bottle taken from Mark Prentice's home.
Harding had simply lifted the prints from a bottle in Prentice's house and then said that they had come from the scene of the crime. Harding was arrested. He was also discovered to have fabricated the prints of Shirley King and convicted of perjury. Prentice's conviction was also set aside. One of those who testified against him now said they'd been pressured by the police. Prentice served 6.5 years in prison before being released.
Yeah, how do you feel? I ain't gonna lie to you, I like to beat him up. But I'm trying not to go there. He took a lot out of my life, you know. My 3 kids growed up. See, I can't get that time back, you know.
And even taking photos of prints in place is no longer a safeguard, because Harding photographically superimposed fingerprints onto the backgrounds of evidence to mislead jurors. It was not just those who were framed who were left to pick up the pieces.
Well, it just an extreme disappointment that David would do something like that, I guess. It just, I don't know how to describe it, but it puts it in a category of betrayal or disappointment, and yet you know how emotionally he was tied to the case, and maybe he wanted the evidence to reflect this, and maybe that's why it was fabricated, or that's why he did what he did.
Harding was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but still found it possible to justify his actions.
In forensic investigation, fingerprint evidence is some of the best evidence you can have as far as convicting someone. It doesn't take a lot of information to arrest someone. It takes a lot to convict. And that's what we wanted to do, to take the violent people off the street. We had to convict them. Fingerprint evidence is some of the best evidence to have to do that. But we don't steal, don't profit from this. We're doing what we thought was right, what needed to be done to protect the public.
If David Harding is saying that he did this for a noble cause, I would say that that's just another lie in a long string of lies. It's quite clear that he didn't do this for a noble cause. The Shirley King case is a perfect example. Other than the fingerprint that he fabricated, there's no other evidence of her involvement in the crimes that took place at the house. How can it be a noble cause to frame somebody when you have no other evidence, simply because you believe that she's guilty?
Shirley King had immediately admitted to possession of the Harris family's credit cards, but always denied the charges of burglary and arson. She served 2 years in prison before her conviction was set aside. And it was not just Harding who had been at fault. His unit was found responsible for a total of 34 fingerprint fabrications.
Anybody who thinks that fingerprint evidence tampering is a thing of the past now is a fool. You simply cannot assume that any scientific evidence is above reproach. Anything that has human involvement has to be questioned like any other evidence in a criminal case. Nothing is foolproof.
The development of fingerprinting techniques and ballistics evidence revolutionized crime detection in the 20th century. Even so, 57 years after the debacle of the Oaks case, in Britain and America, it is perfectly legal to present a lifted print in evidence without preserving it in the place from where it was taken or photographing it there. What has emerged is that even the best scientific evidence is only as trustworthy as the people who are using it.
And even when those people are trustworthy, a new study indicates that many fingerprint analysts are less than competent. When a group of examiners was recently tested for proficiency, 1 in 5 made at least one error, the kind of error that could put an innocent person in prison. In recent years, defendants have begun filing motions claiming that fingerprinting is unreliable, and some crime experts predict the technique will soon be obsolete, a victim of the DNA revolution.